Good morning, Americas. Good afternoon, Africa and Europe. And good evening to everyone joining us in Asia. Thank you for joining our webinar today. So as the business school for the world, INSEAD is keenly aware that we must contribute to global efforts to disrupt systemic racism. In line with this goal, the Hoffman Institute and our Lifelong Learning have organized this second webinar in our series, following from our session on learning about systemic racism itself. We could not have a better speaker for this topic than Professor Stephanie Creary, who will be joining us from the Wharton School. She has close ties with us, especially in our organizational behavior group, but also through the formal alliance that we have with the Wharton School. She also has been teaching our MBAs when they visit Wharton through the alliance for several years. So Stephanie has expertise on this topic with depth and breadth, and I very much look forward to hearing from her. Stephanie, we're ready to learn from you about how to be the allies we want to be. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and good morning from Philadelphia. I want to begin by acknowledging that we here in Philadelphia are struggling. We're continuing to struggle, but we're struggling once again because on Monday night, another Black man, his name is Walter Wallace, was tragically killed by police. His family had called the police for an ambulance. As the same number, 911 is the same number that you call if you need to transport someone to the hospital. And when you need to transport someone to the hospital, the police often come as well. It's just the way that it works here. And Walter was in the midst of a mental health crisis. He has bipolar disorder. And so he was experiencing a state of mania, and his family called, his mother called to ask them to transport him to the hospital. Unfortunately, Walter had a knife, a small knife, but police had guns. And what happened then was, there's a video online. I've not watched it, you can watch it. But what you see is his mother shouting at the police not to shoot him, not to kill him. And then what happens later is the police kill him. And so we, since Monday night, have once again had our world ripped apart in trying to figure out why do these things happen in quite this way? Aren't there other ways to de-escalate the states of minds that people come in, especially when they are sick? And so we had overnight lockdown last night at 9 p.m. and it just lifted at 6 a.m. And so as I share with you that experience here in the US, certainly it goes to say that that is at the heart of many of the struggles that we're having, and certainly forms the foundation of this talk that I want to give to you today. But I'm also going to talk to you about how these incidents, they're not just US incidents, they're globally relevant. And I'm sure in many of the countries in which you live, maybe they're not Black, of African descent, the people who are suffering, maybe they are indigenous or some other population. But I think where we are now as a society is we're understanding so many of our issues and challenges are universal, and what can we do, particularly as humans, when these things happen. Obviously today I'm gonna talk to you about how to be an ally for Black colleagues, and I'll focus specifically on Black, given the particular context of what's been happening over the summer and the fall. But I do believe that many of these incidents and certainly reactions or responses that one might offer can transcend to other groups. But let me talk a little bit about the global relevance of this conversation before I move specifically into the what can you do. So first, racial discrimination is a global phenomenon. Now we may not call it race. We may not all talk about it with the same degree of openness. Again, we might not have the shared understanding of racial discrimination as a global issue, but it is in fact a global issue. It is tied to political and economic history, are intertwined political and economic history around the world. And I think there are at least three political, economic, and social histories that one should be thinking about when they're thinking about, well, do we really have a race problem here, or is that really just a US thing? I hear that a lot. So I'm here to tell you, yes, you do have a race problem. It may not be tied to the same, it may not have its same historical roots as the US, but certainly it exists everywhere. And so to give you evidence for that, we have evidence of colonialism, of people from one country going to another country or continent and redeveloping. So as a mean of political and economic gain, actually accessing goods and services and land that exists. And so our history of colonialism, of occupying new lands with or without permission, has created issues of race and racism between those who were there indigenous prior to the colonialization of the land and those who are colonizing and have colonized the land. So we often see racial issues, issues of racial discrimination towards those who are indigenous to that land, to that area, that geography, to that that space. And oftentimes the indigenous people are placed in lower regard than those who have colonized. Certainly, we also have this idea of imperialism, which formed the basis of much of Asian history in many different countries in Asia, tribalism, also in the continent of Africa as well. And so imperialism is very much tied to colonialism. There's certainly a more of a political bent to it. So this understanding that domination or rule of one people or one group of people having rule over another. And certainly those who are in the ruling class become the dominant group and oftentimes the dominant race. And those who are not in the ruling class have become the subordinated race. And so while these things have happened back then, certainly many of this still continues to happen now, we have legacy effects of where it's institutionalized and instantiated into many of the systems that we've created, our governing systems, our political and our economic systems. And certainly there was slavery. And certainly when we look at the US context, so much of what is driving our racial discrimination, the systemic racism, as we know, was our history of slavery. That said, we are a colonized country as well. So let's not forget that for the Native American or the indigenous population here, the form of racism that they experience, much of it is not tied to slavery. It is actually tied to the history of the US being a colonized country. And so I want to remind us as we're talking about, and I'm using US examples and talking about our history of slavery, that the US did not invent slavery. The US was a beneficiary of slavery and certainly allowed it to promulgate for some time. So slavery, especially the form of it that touched the US, we often talk about it as the Atlantic slave trade, involved the United Kingdom and Europe, countries in Europe. It involved Africa, many different countries in Africa. It involved South America and it involved North America. So when we step back and say, we don't have a race problem, it's the US's problem and their legacy of slavery, just remind yourself that there were many different continents involved in this terrible evil that has created massive widespread racial discrimination in the United States. I also want to acknowledge colorism as a phenomenon that exists in many different countries around the world. And that's the idea that people who have light or whiter skin are often in the privileged class, because light or white skin is often favored in many societies and cultures around the world. And so we have evidence that suggests that having lighter or whiter skin often opens up more opportunities than those to people relative to those who have darker skin tones. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about racial discrimination as a global phenomenon. It's historical, it's a legacy, and it's also still very much evident in our day-to-day experiences as we evaluate who has the opportunity, who can have opportunity based on physical appearance and based on the color of their skin. And so let me give you more insights into the current context that certainly motivated me to talk about allyship and to continue to share the message that I have, the science that I've been conducting and others in this context and in the global context. And so what I want to help you to understand is there is certainly a wide body of academic research that really helps to explain what we're seeing here in the United States and what we're seeing around the world. And I also think about, I was teaching my students yesterday, and we were talking about the movement to end SARS, the police state in Nigeria that is currently dehumanizing people who are protesting. So if you haven't paid attention to that, you can look at #EndSARS. But what we see in the video are the police firing into and killing protesters who are trying to end police brutality. So we see all this aggression. I gave you the US version of aggression, the example of Walter Wallace and him tragically losing his life, and then certainly EndSARS, that type of aggression by police. The famed social psychologist Albert Bandura would say the following. He did a lot of research trying to understand what drives aggressive behavior or acts of aggression. And he has these famous psychological experiments where he invites people to into a room and gives them messages about the people who are on the other side of this one-way mirror. He might tell them these people are really terrible, they're really violent, or he might tell them positive messages. And so what he found was that the more that individuals who were on one side of the mirror were filled with negative rhetoric and insights about those on the other side of the mirror, the more willing that those who had the power to punish were more likely to deliver a severe punishment. In this case, the severe punishment was a fake shock. It was this idea I could shock people if they're doing things that I think are bad. And so this idea that he developed suggested that we can and we do dehumanize people. We take the very idea that they are living, breathing souls who should have the right to life as much as we do. When we lose that, and also at the same time, when we decide that it's not our problem, when we take ourselves out of the equation and we say that's really their issue, that's their country, not our country, that doesn't have anything to do with us, we're more likely to then engage in aggressive behavior. So I think it's important to understand the social psychological roots of aggression before we begin to try to understand what's happening and what's our role in this process. And so certainly it goes without saying, we've been in this vicious cycle of violence and aggression in the US forever, but certainly we had one of the more recent peaks was between the years of 2016 and 2018, around the time of our last US presidential election. And so during the last presidential election, probably starting around 2014 to 2015, we saw a rise in social media posts showing in graphic detail the killings of multiple Black men in different cities in the US by police. And police not being prosecuted for these crimes. And we weren't seeing the same level of, the same severe repercussions, meaning loss of life or death. We weren't seeing that when the same crime or the same sets of behavior were exhibited by our white citizens. So it seemed as if, and all appearances suggested, that Black men were experiencing harsher penalties, including loss of life, for rather minor, or even if they were more severe crimes, they were being handled with much greater punishment. And there's actually a lot of research that suggests that is the case, that Black people are penalized more harshly for the same crimes relative to white people. In any case, so this is what we've been dealing with 2014, all of these murders. And this was in the last presidential election. There was a lot of talk about that, but there was also a lot of talk about other ethnicities. Immigration has been a topic of conversation for some time. And during the last presidential election, what was happening was our current president was not only saying disparaging things about Black people, he was also saying disparaging things around people from other countries and who we wanted here and who we didn't. And he was painting many people who were from non-Euro countries, non-white countries as murderers, right? So we don't want them here in our country because they're going to take our crime up. So that was the whole divisive rhetoric at the time. Well, as you know, he became elected our president. And so we continue to have a lot of challenges here in the US. At the same time, there's an icon here, We're Out. Certainly the UK with Brexit and other countries around the world where there was a rise in populism and nationalism, we're experiencing similar accounts of xenophobia or racism towards groups who were not part of the majority. So we have been here, and also with the rise in the Me Too movement, certainly, so this idea of ending sexual harassment against all genders, but especially it's a problem here in the US towards women. This is sort of where we have been. And I think what is perpetuating this idea that we need to begin to come up with solutions that are not just structural, but also interpersonal. If I just take us to the current time, this summer, we had a greater and more globally relevant response to this notion of Black Lives Matter. And so in the previous period between 2016 and 2018, it was considered much more of a fringe movement, and it was often compared to those who were using the iconography that Donald Trump is perpetuating around making America great again. So these were positioned as competing movements, if you will, and competing extreme movements. As many of you know here, this idea of Black Lives Matter has taken off in rather amazing ways. And that obviously what sparked this conscientiousness. One reason is that many of us were under lockdown because of the coronavirus. And so we are consuming media much more than we are normally, because normally we're out and about visiting, going to movies and going to cultural events. But under lockdown conditions, we've had not much more to do. Yes, we work, but not much more to do than to consume social media and consume regular television media. From that standpoint, what we were able to learn was that the murder of a man, George Floyd, by police in Minnesota was something that resonated with a lot of people, and it promulgated a greater Black Lives Matter movement around the world. And so certainly, I will not suggest that it's George Floyd that many countries and many citizens around the world are talking about. It's this idea of how do these things happen, and what do Black lives in our country, how do they feel? How do they matter? Do they matter? So I would say that the murder of George Floyd has sparked, I think, a growing racial consciousness around the world in deeper level of inquiry into what does this mean for us. So interestingly enough, for us in the US, when we look at Black and Brown populations, so Brown are people who are of Hispanic, Latino descent, we see very similar outcomes. So Black and Brown people are often dying at the same rates same rates from coronavirus. Many of the societal ills that we experience here in the US are similarly affecting Black and Brown people. And I will add Native American and Indigenous into that category as well. I think if we look around the world, what we also see is this growing awareness that maybe we should be talking about race too, even if we have a national policy that says we're to be colorblind. And so in the middle of the screen, I grabbed this from one of the French newspapers, and it questions that France may be a colorblind republic, meaning that France may have this policy around colorblindness and not talking about and not categorizing people. But does that mean we actually do not have a racial issue? And I know that is a sensitive topic in France. I visit France, not when there's coronavirus, often. And it's always an interesting experience as a Black African-American woman, what I should be saying and what I shouldn't be saying based on national policy. But I do know that France is one of the many countries that is grappling with what's our place in this conversation. And do we or do we not have a race issue that we need to contend with? I wanted to blow up this slide for you, or this picture. This was in the previous slide. I came across this earlier this summer, and I thought this was fascinating. And there is a person who has been, since May 25th, tracking Black Lives Matter protests around the world. And if you look at this, you will see everywhere except for Antarctica, so on every continent, there have been Black Lives Matter protests. So it is telling you that this idea that Black Lives Matter, whether it's my Black life or your African Black lives in your country, or maybe it's not Black, maybe it's Latin, maybe it's just race matters. This is picking up, and this has become a global issue that all of us need to contend with in some way or another. Okay, so I want to, as I've painted that picture for you to hopefully motivate you to continue to stay engaged in this conversation, I want to talk about allyship in the workplace, which is why many of you are here, is to help yourself, to enlighten yourselves on what you might be able to do, given all of this tragedy, but also all of this opportunity to make the world a better place. I first want to begin to tell you that allyship is certainly not only important to us as individuals, it's also important to the organizations in which we work. Research suggests that having an ally, having a positive relationship, having high quality connections with others can lead to better physical and psychological health. It allows us to engage in our work tasks more fully, and it can increase our willingness and capacity to learn. And so certainly having all of these workers and all of these employees who are feeling healthy, engaged, and more willing to learn and to contribute can be beneficial to our organizations. It can increase our capacity to cooperate and coordinate across units. People who feel engaged in their work are more likely to want to stay, so they don't leave. They want to stay working in that organization. And then the organization as a whole can experience increased capacity for learning. So what do I mean by allyship? Well, let me tell you first, allyship is a behavior. It requires action. It's not just thinking about being an ally. It's actually doing something called allyship. And that's really about responding to the needs of the moment. Anyone can be an ally. So when I talk about this, I want you to imagine not any one race, any one gender, any one sexual orientation, any one religious affiliation being an ally. Anyone can be an ally. Allyship occurs when someone who has some level of power and privilege uses that power and privilege to help someone who can benefit. We all have power and privilege. I use the example of myself. I am a Black woman in America. I'm also a professor at the Wharton School. So what does that mean? That means my racial identity is often marginalized here in this country. My gender identity is often marginalized in this country. But I work at one of the top business schools in the world, and there's a lot of privilege that comes with that. And so whereas I might not have all of the time racial and gender privilege compared to those who are in the dominant group, I certainly have professional privilege, and I can use my privilege as a professor at the Wharton School to help other people. So you all have the power and the privilege to use some aspect of your affiliation, your resources to help other people who are in need. But what does that require? That requires us actually knowing what people need, actually caring about what people need, attending to and supporting one another's needs and one another's needs and goals. So we need to understand what those needs are. We need to validate those needs as being important. And we also need to care enough to want to be supportive and also to want to help. And so this summer, as I was thinking about lots of things, certainly the current context of systemic racism, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, many Black Americans in such a short period of time. And again, going back to 2014, the death of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, I'm trying to figure out how I can take science and turn that into solutions for individuals. And so I wrote this article that was published in Harvard Business Review called How to Be a Better Ally to Your Black Colleagues. And that forms the basis of the rest of our conversation here today. And so I'm going to tell you about that framework, and then I'm going to share some stories with you that I think speak to some of the heart of this framework. I always like to show this image to people because What this image is of a woman who is taking a huge leap over some nondescript body of water, but she has a life jacket on, right, to stop her from drowning. And I like to think of the LEAP framework as that life jacket. You have to be courage enough to take that leap, but you also need to have tools to make sure that when you are connecting with other people and trying to be helpful, that you know how to do that in a way that allows you to continue to float, if you will, and not drown in the interaction. So that's the purpose and the motivation of the LEAP framework. So you need to, like I said, be courageous. You also need to recognize your privilege in this situation and monitor that. So you can use your privilege, what you have available to you because you are privileged, but you also have to be mindful of how you as a privileged person, that's a power dynamic that enters into that relationship. And so you need to be mindful of that power dynamic as you're trying to support someone else who might need your help. Empathy is huge in this conversation as well. So what does LEAP stand for? LEAP stands for listening and learning. I also talk about this as looking. So we could say looking, listening, and learning, engaging, asking, and providing. And so in the HBR article, I talked about this as listening and learning from your Black colleagues about their experiences. Being very clear that you understand and you are putting yourself in a space of trying to learn and listen before you act is really important. Engaging is how do you connect with your Black colleagues in different settings? So formal evaluative settings where you are the person who is deciding their next raise, that's a very hard place for people to be vulnerable and to ask for help. But more casual, informal settings, meeting people where they are. I talk about in the article, employee resource group meetings, places that are diverse where there are other people just like the person who you want to support present are way better places to begin to think about how to be an ally. Asking is so important, being curious. Now there are things to be curious about, and there are things that you might not want to be curious about. I say in this article that asking Black colleagues about their work and anything you might be able to do to help is really important. What my research and other research suggests is that Black colleagues aren't often asked about their work. They're asked more about their culture or their clothes or their hair or something that really isn't about their performance. And while that might be fine outside of work hours, at work hours, we really need to be asking Black colleagues more about their work because we often find out that they're not getting the same support that we are. And providing is actually the giving people the help that they need based on what you learned previously. And so there are different types of support one might be able to provide. It might just be advice. It might be encouragement. It also might be speaking up whenever there's an issue of bias or discrimination that's been brought to you by a Black colleague. It might be advocating or sponsoring for them for a new opportunity. So there are levels to this. And certainly as we think about some of the more, the riskier, if you will, the ones that as an individual you might perceive as risky, so speaking out against bias or speaking up for somebody and advocating for them for an opportunity, we see that less of those forms of allyship, of the provision of help, are often received by those who are Black. And so we want to be mindful of there are different ways of investing ourselves and our resources, but some of those bigger leaps are certainly necessary if we want to be able to advance the opportunities for people who are Black. So what I want to do very briefly before we go into Q&A is I want to give you some stories of people shared with me around each of these aspects of the LEAP framework. And so I collected many stories over the past couple of years, but here are some where people are talking about allyship as listening and learning. And so the first person says they accepted a new job. They found a completely new world in this job, and it surprised them. So they told their boss they needed advice on how to demonstrate the real potential. And the boss paid so much attention to their words and without offering too many explanations. So this idea of having a boss who just listens to you without interrupting and talking over or trying to explain what the situation is was really an important experience of allyship for this person. This other person says, while sharing airline industry knowledge with my coworker, I was a good listener to him. So they talk about when they were a good ally. This helped me understand his skills better and allowed me to go above and beyond with my capabilities to help him in any way I could. So one can feel like they've had a good ally who listens and learns, and one can also be a good ally by listening and learning. Next is engaging. This is somebody who says, I come from a poor family that won a lot of battles to give us, my siblings and I, chances to study and progress. In every company I've ever worked for, I've identified at least one person with this profile, meaning the same background that this person has. And I make sure to create an interaction that will allow me to share effective steps and lessons for the future. Some people still contact me occasionally to tell me about their achievements, which motivates me to continue. So this person being purposeful and intentional in creating opportunities to engage with people who might need their support. That was their story of how they're trying to be a good ally to other people who may need one. This one is about asking. So again, there's a story here of a time when someone was a good ally for other people and a time when someone felt like they have had a good ally for them. So the first story, I think I'm a good ally for my employees since they're leaving their job. I'm having direct conversations about what I can do to support them before I leave. So one of their employees, their direct reports, is a Chinese immigrant who I encouraged to make the first presentation ever, to present the work to the company. The other is a younger lady who I've given lots of coaching and direction to. So again, trying to, even though this person is on their way out the door to another employer, really trying to make sure that they are providing the opportunity for those who they are leaving behind to be successful, even though they will no longer be there. And then this is someone saying, having had a great ally, I've had people in my life that have been curious about my experiences, and me, I've also been curious about their experiences. These relationships have helped me to increase mutual understanding of the struggles we all face as human beings. This understanding has positioned us to drive change. Those that have engaged in helping improve life for others, I consider allies. And finally, providing. This is a person talking about being receiving allyship from the boss. My first manager was a symbol of allyship. He stepped in when a coworker made disparaging remarks with racist undertones and ensured they were held accountable. So remember, I talked about there's levels to this, and this is certainly a manager who did what many of us would consider the riskiest thing, was to step in and ensure that somebody who says racist things, that they're held accountable for the impact that their racist behavior is having on others. And this is the last quote is somebody talking about how they're trying to provide allyship to other people. I provided myself in being an advocate to peers, management, and employees. I try to always challenge the status quo when others fail to acknowledge or discount certain individuals. I've helped several individuals get promoted. I've promoted individuals, and I've mentored and coached many. I believe allyship is not a one-time event. It's a culture which I always live by. And with that, I will leave you with these two words, equity and growth. This is the point of allyship. It's about creating equity, allowing all of us the opportunity to be successful, no matter what our racial backgrounds are. And it's also allowing us to grow as individuals, to allow our relationships to grow and thrive, and us as a community and a global community at that. So now I'm going to turn it back to Zoe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your work with us. And we have several questions. A couple of them are my own, and then we have several wonderful questions from the audience as well. So I'd like to start, this is not one that was articulated online now, but we sometimes hear people concerned that allyship might focus on race in a way that unfairly favors Black people. Yeah. Or to think about this a little bit differently, if someone were to ask, why do Black people need special treatment? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's certainly something that I've heard a lot. There's something about naming a characteristic or a category or a demographic group and saying, let's make sure we pay attention to that and give people who fall into that group help, right? And so what benefit does come from targeting people based on, in this case, race? Well, absolutely a lot of benefit, because what we have learned is that when we identify that people based on what their racial group is, and we look at outcomes, we see, particularly in the US and in other countries around the world, that people who have that characteristic, in this case, Black race, are disproportionately negatively impacted. And so we could turn and look the other way and not pay attention because we don't want to talk about race, or we can decide that feels problematic. So one answer to this question is we have to pay attention. If we don't pay attention, we cannot fix the issue, the issue of inequity. So is this unfair special treatment? It's not unfair special treatment if you're actually giving people support that if they had gotten earlier at some other point in their life, in their career, there would be a level playing field. And so the idea here is, as we're talking about these inequities and these disproportionate negative impact that Black people are facing, we're also acknowledging that they have not often had the same, as a population, that doesn't mean one Black person, but I mean, as a population, have not had the same resources, opportunities that people who are white have had, particularly, I'll speak for the US context. And so it's not special treatment if it's actually giving people the resources that they need that they were never given before. But I do think that it's easy for us to think about it as being special treatment because we've named a group, particularly in this conversation.
Thank you, Stephanie. And just to follow up a little bit on that, I think you've just spoken against this idea, but in case anyone is concerned about meritocratic systems, if we focus on people's skills and qualifications, why do we need the LEAP framework? Could we just focus on being meritocratic?
Yeah. So we have this wonderful, Zoe and I, this wonderful colleague in management, Professor Emilio Castilla. He's at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he has spent his life's work debunking the myth of meritocracy, but also the paradox of meritocracy. So I'm going to reference his work as I talk about this. So meritocracy is this idea, is aspirational. And also in psychology, there's this idea of merit as well that has contributed to this conversation. But the aspiration of meritocracy is a world in which what we put in, we get out. So there's an equal ratio of effort to rewards. It's this idea that the system is fair and actually allows that to happen. And it's also grounded in the belief, in the US, we talk about this as the Protestant work ethic. Part of this is the conversation that you shouldn't have other responsibilities other than work. So if everyone can be the ideal worker, then that will help to contribute to meritocratic outcomes. What Emilio's research says in practice is that those of us who tend to hold steadfast to our beliefs that this actually is in the here and now and in this moment a meritocracy. So having these meritocratic belief and being so instantiating in them without truly believing that that there isn't a meritocracy, we tend to engage in more biased behavior because we're not looking for the gaps. We're actually not willing to believe that the system may not be fair. So another way to put this is, if you truly believe that the system is fair, you might have blind spots and you might be missing instances of where it isn't fair. And so as we're talking about meritocracy and the challenges of believing there's a meritocracy when there isn't, we also have to acknowledge how people get ahead. And over the course of the last 6 months at this point, I've talked to a lot of people, to leaders and certainly to students. And when you talk to people who are very senior, they say, when I started off my career, I thought all I had to do was put my head down and work hard. Meritocracy, remember? All I thought I had to do was put my head down and work hard, and then I would get ahead. But as I became more senior, I realized I need mentors and sponsors and advocates and allies. And those people were those who helped pull me over the hump of getting from middle management to senior management. So while we tend to use the word merit a lot, most people who are successful know that other people's efforts were responsible for getting them also to where they were in life. So let's not fool ourselves into believing it's only our efforts that allow us to be successful. It's also building positive relationships with other people who are willing to advocate and nurture and coach us.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Elko has asked a question live that had also come up as a pre-question for your webinar. So we've got curiosity about how the LEAP model connects to political correctness. And the question that we got before was about, is it an ally's responsibility to be politically correct? And Elko is asking if political correctness is maybe not enough to be able to be a good ally.
Yeah, it's a good question. And what's fascinating about this, as I've been sharing this framework with multiple audiences, I've had people say to me, Stephanie, if you could just tell us what we should call people and what words we should use, I think everything would be better. And I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do that, because that evolves. I mean, there is certain, it's like calling me black, right? When a long time ago, there were other words to call me. I mean, this is just part of what we learn and we know about other people. I think sometimes there are extremes. There's always a continuum, but there are extremes. There are people who don't care what words come out of their mouth and the impact or harm that they have. And there are people who are spending a lot of time monitoring everything that they're saying, and they're having a hard time having an authentic interaction with people. We are trying to find this space as humans in the middle of where we are not only empowered to say what we're thinking, we're also being humble enough and showing enough humility to know that sometimes we might get it wrong. And so for me, I'm not at all suggesting that we need to be politically correct. I'm just saying you need to understand that your actions have impact. And certainly as others who are in that space, we need to be giving other people the opportunity to make mistakes and to ask questions without severe punishment. So I'm not advocating for totally monitoring everything you're saying. And I also don't think you should just say everything that you want to say all the time if it's hurtful. I do think you need to practice humility, and you need to admit that you might not know the right thing to say or how that person wants to receive it. And I think the last point that I want to make about this is political correctness is not universal. I mean, every time I go to France, people are talking about things that I'm like, we do not say these things in the US. Like, these are not workplace conversations. But that's my US culture saying, no, we won't talk about that stuff. Whereas in France, people say things that, make me blush, right? And so that's why this idea of political correctness and trying to figure out the one way or the one thing to say can be very tricky, because it's culturally contingent. And if you're not from that culture, there's no way you're ever possibly going to know how to engage unless you learn. So be humble, be curious, but also apologize and allow people to make mistakes.
Thank you, Stephanie. And what you've just been saying ties so closely to what Jung was asking in the questions. I'll go to this question next. The question is, some are accused of what they did unintentionally in the past. They admit and regret the mistakes. For example, Trudeau and the brown face in the 1990s, but they could still be harshly criticized by the public later. How can people be forgiven for what they did or said in the past?
Yeah, I think what Trudeau and others, so there are so many, right? Because, and I'll give one more example, is so Halloween. Here in the US, there are many people who've dressed up as Indigenous Native Americans for Halloween. There are people who have worn sombreros, so cultural hats from Mexico. And this is like, now we know that is not okay to dress up, to paint a caricature of someone's culture during a holiday that's about fear. And, it's just not okay, but it was okay for a long time. So what do we do about it? I think the important thing is to say, here's what I did. Here's what I was thinking at the time. I know now that that was not right, and that is bad. And I am committed to not only not continuing to do that, but to also to educate other people about why this is problematic. So it's not just admitting that you were wrong, it's a commitment to being a champion for good behavior. So using your example to help other people no longer do that, I think is really the appropriate way to repent. I think also about the truth and reconciliation committees that exist in Rwanda and elsewhere. So with the Rwandan genocide, remember that, and it's so fascinating and I think so uplifting to see while people from these two ethnicities killed each other, right, because of the ethnic conflict there, they've managed to create much more harmony and understanding of one another because they admit wrongdoing and they're committed to reconciling. And reconciling isn't simply saying I'm sorry. It's how do you work together in tangible ways to right the wrong. So for Trudeau and everybody else who really wants to change, put policies in place, do things that are systemic and structural to actually begin to help us understand that you truly do want things to be different and that you contributed to the problem, but now you're trying to contribute to the solution.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I have one more of my questions, and then we have several great questions that have been coming up in the chat that I want to get back to. And this is because it's come up in several conversations that I've had myself in the last couple of weeks, is could you speak explicitly to how the LEAP model connects to potential concerns about white people being saviors for Black or other Indigenous people that you've been talking about in this way? So this concern is that there might be white heroes sweeping in to be the saviors in a paternalistic or colonial kind of sense. So just tying back to what you were talking about in the beginning.
Yeah, so sadly, anything can be weaponized, right? So someone who is ill-intentioned, who is only out to support people because of the glow or the reward that they will receive from doing so, could very well take this LEAP framework and paint themselves as very much a white savior. So how do we stop that from happening? Either somebody weaponizing it or somebody unintentionally contributing to this idea of saving those poor Black people, right? Because that is what happens and that's often how it's perceived. So I mentioned this word, and I probably will say it at least 5 more times before we end the call: humility. Humility is a virtue. It's also a character trait. Humility means many things, but one thing I want you to think about is how do you enter into a situation knowing that it is not about you? It is really about the other person. So we talk about this as, who are we centering in this LEAP interaction? Are we centering ourselves and what we have to gain from it, meaning the adoration from others? Or are we centering the other person who actually does need some support? And I would argue that humility is actually centering the other person and what they need and not our own experience. So it starts with humility. It also is about agency and credit. So agency is this idea that we all, no matter that I just told you, that we all need help. We all want to feel like there's some aspect of ourselves, the effort that we put in is somewhat tied to our outcomes. Most people do not want to be told that you got here because Mike advocated for you. That might be true, but I also want you to say that you did a lot of work and we saw that, and Mike thought that he wanted to narrate that for someone else. And so don't take away people's agency by overclaiming credit or overclaiming your role in the situation. It's not that, for example, Zoe was sitting there and doing nothing and that I came in and saved the day. It's that Zoe was doing lots of great things. I saw that and I thought Zoe needed her experiences to be amplified. That's what I did. I just amplified what Zoe was already doing because I thought more people should hear about it. So that's the difference. And the last piece here I wanted to say is people who in our field, Zoe, who study pro-social behavior and pro-social motivation, talk about this idea of self-interest and other interests in altruism and what's the difference in all these things. So entirely altruistic behavior would be that I am doing this just for the benefit of the other person. And people who study pro-social behavior, of which LEAP and allyship is, say, you know, the self is never entirely taken out of, you know, we all get a little bit of good juice, good juju, if you will, from feeling like we did something, and that's fine. Just don't let it overpower the moment, the person's experience, and certainly don't let it become the narrative of who Zoe is. Zoe is a perfectly competent and capable adult. She just needs some support. We all need support. And so in that, also normalizing, I just gave Zoe what everybody gets. I decided to help her out in that way.
Stephanie, I love all of your support for me. I haven't glowed so much in a while because I've done so much hard work, and you're just helping to amplify it. I appreciate that. It does feel good, actually. I appreciate it. But I wanted to spend a few minutes. We've gotten some really wonderful questions about different contexts and how your work relates in those. And I knew you were excited to reflect on these questions with us. So I'd like to move to those now. The first one was from Pushan very early in your presentation. He was talking about Isabel Wilkerson and how she argues that India's caste system creates a group of untouchables, and that this is more illuminating of racism in America. So he was curious if you see that racism as a visible manifestation of something deeper. And he's also asking a system of social dominance and heritable hierarchy that underlies the white supremacy. And he was curious about your thoughts on her perspective.
Yeah. So last week I watched Isabel Wilkerson did a presentation for Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and I was given the link to dial in to this presentation. So I listened to her talk for about an hour, and I was pretty convinced. I know some about the caste system just in having read and having talked to students, but the parallels that she tries to draw between the caste system in India and the system of social hierarchy and white supremacy in the US is very similar. She talks about how the word untouchables became a term that Martin Luther King learned about when he visited India. There was a person there who said to him, "You're just like us." So a person who was of Indian descent said to Martin Luther King, "You're like us. You're also one of the untouchables." And Martin Luther King is like, Martin Luther King had a PhD, Reverend, the Civil Rights Movement. He's at the center of this, Nobel Peace Prize. And then the more that he learned about it, the more that he understood is this idea that we create ruling classes and lower social classes. And these things go on for generations. And it becomes really hard, even when you get rid of the system, for things to normalize. So just saying it doesn't exist anymore, we don't do that anymore, that does not change the situation. And so I really do believe in reading Wilkerson's work and listening to her presentation that there are some enormous, and sadly, there are some enormous parallels. And I do think that we can stand to learn a lot from one another's situations as we think about this. I also want to say I fully acknowledge that this is controversial and that there are people in India who take somewhat of an offense to us thinking about the caste system in the US in quite this way. But before we judge, I would invite you to read the book so at least you can have some understanding of how she's drawing those parallels. But thank you for the question. I think it's certainly a very interesting topic, and I think the book is fantastic.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before we take another question about culture, Rachel has asked a question I'm sure you get all over the world, and I think will be useful for anyone hearing, anyone who's listening to this. The idea that the person who is sharing could start to get fatigued because they start to feel that they are in the listening. So the person who says, I'm listening, how do we prevent the person who's receiving the allyship feeling fatigue and feeling like they have to educate or school their ally? Do people ask you about this?
Yeah. So I have another framework that I call the race framework. And I talk about, the C in the race framework. You can see my trick now is to take a word and to build out understanding that way. But the C in the race framework is calling on internal and external allies for support. So it goes without saying, whenever there is racial upheaval and racism, the first sets of people who people often turn to are Black people. And so we talk about this as the Black tax. So it's this idea that whenever race comes up in a classroom, in the workplace, we are expected to be the communicators, the purveyors of comprehension for everybody. And that is exhausting. Now, for me, I decided to make a job out of it, right? So it's the idea is that even when I wasn't doing this work, I was doing this work. So so I thought maybe that'd be a great thing to study to make a career out of. So to me, it's just like, any job. But certainly now I'm doing lots of jobs because not only am I doing the one I normally do, I'm appearing everywhere and it's kind of tiresome. So how do we prevent that? Well, what the C in the race framework says is white people need to take the responsibility to become experts in conversations about race. So the way that you stop leaning on Black people to make sense of the situation for you is by actually learning. And how do you learn? There are lots of books written. There are lots of academic articles written. There are lots of things that you can consume on your own before you come and ask a Black person about it, right? And so when you actually do need help, make it high value ask. Say, Stephanie, I just read this book on caste and I heard all of these things. I was wondering if I could ask you, I don't know if you've read the book or not, but I was wondering if I could ask you about this one thing. But don't come from a place of asking a question that we feel like you could have Googled and found the answer to. Come with some knowledge and take it upon yourself to now be someone who will share that information, as opposed to it always having to be from somebody who comes in my body. And the reality is I want to, as I continue to adore Zoe in these interactions, is Zoe knows a lot about this topic, just so you know. Zoe and I are here working together as allies for one another to share with you, but you can go ask Zoe, just so you know, a lot of this information, right? And she can help. And she can also tell you when you should come and ask me. She might say, you know what, let me point you to these things first. And if you get stuck, maybe you can go ask Stephanie. And as a matter of fact, let me ask Stephanie for you if it's okay that I put you two in contact. So that's another way to sort of prevent the Black tax from becoming the exhaustion that it is.
Thank you, Stephanie. And you flatter me too much. I need to stay humble. My expertise is not at the level with Stephanie's here. Caroline had also asked a very similar question. So I really along a similar vein. And then there were a couple of questions coming from different folks. This was Thomas and Sheetal, and I think there was one more, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the name now, who were really curious about what you had said about focusing on the work in the work context. Yeah. So there's some cultural tensions around this, and why should we be focusing on work? What's the right balance seems to be the main gist of the questions.
I can understand the cultural tensions because we are in a far extreme in the US of not bringing our personal lives to the workplace. So let me sort of make that also culturally relevant and how that can negatively impact people of color who are Black. So oftentimes when people are talking about non-work related matters in the workplace, when they're thinking about somebody who might seem foreign to them, either because they're from a different race or because they're from a different culture. A lot of the questions or the curiosities that people are trying to meet are not about positive things. So it's not necessarily saying, here's what I can appreciate your culture, can you tell me more? It's like, that's a very interesting hairstyle that you have. And it's almost put in it's looked at as like exotic, but not in a negative, but not in a positive way. So what I'm suggesting here is, yes, you can ask. In some cultures, it might be more culturally appropriate to talk about things about people that have nothing to do with their work, but understands that oftentimes that your Black colleagues are being asked about things that put them on the spot and make them feel uncomfortable because your tone or what you're asking is about something sensitive, right? And so this is not about political correctness, but this is about knowing that in the US, it's about Black women's hair, right? You can ask about Black women's hair, but don't ask to touch it, right? And so one of the things that often comes up in these conversations in the US is I wish white people would stop touching my hair, right? And so safer for us in the US is let's focus on where people actually need support. People need, and even in your country where you do talk about family and non-work things outside of work, you still need to ask people about their work because that is the differentiator here. So again, more license to talk about non-work things. Be careful, because you might be positioning it in a way that sounds offensive, but we really all need to amplify our focus on Black people's work as well, because that's the deficit. That's where the structural inequity exists.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm conscious that we're out of time. There are 5 more questions that I was hoping to get to hear your answers to tonight. People have been asking such great questions, and we very much appreciate your engagement. And Stephanie, thank you again for coming and sharing your insights with us. I think you're, as I introduced, the depth and breadth of your knowledge and expertise on this is so helpful for us. I hope that we'll get you back again. I know you have lots of work to do educating the world, but it would be lovely to hear from you again in the future. And I believe that the team maybe wanted to put a slide up in closing. Yes. Oh, yes. Our future webinars, there are more to come. So please stay tuned with the lifelong learning series. It's getting late here in Singapore with lifelong learning, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals Week is coming up just next week. We'll be seeing more of you through there. Thank you again, Stephanie, and thank you to the team. Have a good day, afternoon, and evening everywhere. Bye.